Story 1, really odd. I knew him casually from school, and we would sit together at a two-person desk for many classes over several years. He was a good-looking, outgoing athlete, and I was an artistic horse enthusiast, so we never crossed paths socially. But we always said hi when we saw each other during high school and afterward. He had an older brother and younger sister. I knew them too. I knew his brother better because he would bum or hitch rides from school to friends' places if we were heading that way. The whole family was charismatic, an all-American, normal, nice, middle-class family of outgoing kids and mom. I never met the dad. Then, about 7 years after high school, he became schizophrenic. He got a message from God to make a religious rap CD and sell it in New York City. So he drove from Texas to New York City. He ran out of gas money and was trying to sell CDs to get enough to make it to the city. Something happened, and he ended up beating a man to death with a rock on the Jersey Turnpike. He was arrested and put in a mental institution. Really horrible all around. I always felt bad for the entire family. I think they kept him there in New Jersey so his family wasn't nearby. Of all the kids in that school, he was not on my murderer list. Story 2. My former employer killed his spouse. He stabbed her to death during a drunken and heated argument. A year earlier, my friend and I had visited their home for shrimp scampi and rattlesnake shots. The purpose of the visit was to adopt a stray kitten found in their garage. I did not see it coming. Rest in peace, Brenda. Story 3. Wonderful man. Former husband's golf partner. The foursome would come over to our place after playing, and spouses would join. He was the one in the kitchen helping me load trays and clear up. He was dating my ex's secretary, who had an 18-month-old son from a prior relationship. We were all hoping they would announce an engagement soon, as they seemed perfect together, all three. We went back east for Thanksgiving and returned to find him in jail, his partner and her son dead, stabbed to death in what the police called one of the most brutal murders they had seen. Officers broke down on the stand describing the death of the son. To this day, I cannot reconcile the person I met with the murders. But sweet Deborah and her darling boy, you are not and never will be forgotten. Story 4. A guy I played football with in high school was convicted of murdering his girlfriend. They were riding around on back roads outside of the city limits when they started arguing. They both got out of the car and he shot her. He left her there, and the body was discovered shortly after. I cannot say he was a friend, but he was someone I spent a decent amount of time with during practice and occasionally at parties on the weekend. I would have never guessed he would be a murderer, but he did have a strange vibe that was hard to describe. The best way to describe him was very intense. Story 5. It put things into perspective. The man threatened to stab me and my entire family in 8th grade, got into a knife fight, and stabbed a person shortly after graduating. 15 years later, he murdered a woman with a knife. Story 6. I was friends with everyone in high school. I had been bullied relentlessly in middle school, then became popular in high school and refused to make anyone feel less than a respected friend. One kid had his stepdad or real dad shoot himself in front of him after school in 4th grade, and his mom was the town prostitute. Obviously, he had issues, but he was always really nice to me. Our paths crossed mostly at parties. In our junior year, I was a waitress downtown, and my boss sent me to pick something up from his house. It was a very small town, so it seemed normal. The item was a bag of cocaine. I walked it back to work, and my boss told me the bag was light and to bring it back and tell him. I was scared because I had never encountered hard drugs, and I didn't want to get involved. When I returned it, he said he trusted me and would not retaliate. A year later, he took a machete and stabbed and slit his girlfriend's throat, then cut the cord to the landline so she couldn't call for help. She somehow survived, and he turned himself in covered in blood. He served 20 years in prison. When he got out, he contacted me on Facebook to catch up. I'm absolutely terrified of him now, but I was calm about it. The second man was a Peruvian security guard in Chile with orders to kill anyone who entered the property. One night, while drunk, he shot and killed someone who entered the property, but they were guests of the owner. He went to prison in Chile for 20 years. He seemed tough in general, but my husband kept in touch with him throughout his prison sentence until he escaped and fled the country. Story 7. My brother is a serial killer. It was terrible. My mom lost her job as a preschool teacher because of the parents at the school. She was a good mom and loved kids. My brother has the psychopathic gene. Mom struggled and spent several years isolated. My dad worked long hours, 7 days a week, to support the family. He is still struggling and isolated. No one talks to him. I will not reveal who he is or share personal information in any way, not even in direct messages. Story 8. I worked in a jail for almost 10 years, so I have met many men accused or convicted of murder. The truth is, if that was their only charge, they were often the easiest to deal with. They did not cause trouble. Usually it was the minor gang members and drug dealers who were problematic. Most people convicted of murder I encountered committed the act for a reason and then moved on, or they were gang members whose behavior reflected that lifestyle, or they were mentally ill, acting on perceived internal forces. In my experience, people convicted of murder were the easiest to manage. Story 9. I know two separate people who have been to prison for murder. One I knew all through school. He is there for life. The other worked for me until someone hurt his sister. Story 10. He was very kind, quiet, and had great manners. Respectful, never pushed boundaries. I watched him learn how to knit to make hats and scarves for the homeless. He loved his dogs. We did not talk for a few years. He reached out to me and, if I recall correctly, other old friends just saying hey. He had made a few questionable posts prior to that, and I did not respond. He killed his mother a few days later with multiple stab wounds. Story 11. I grew up with a guy who was always kind to me. He was my brother's friend, and he didn't like how my brother and his other friends talked to me. He would call me and talk for hours sometimes. Whenever he came to hang out at our house, he always came into my room to say hey and give me a hug. He was twice my height, very tall, and gave the best hugs. Over the years, he, like most of my brother's friends, got involved with drugs and got in trouble. He was in jail for a while. That is where he met my cousin, who was older than me. The age gap meant they hadn't crossed paths when we were younger. She worked at the jail. They ended up dating when he got out and eventually got married. Less than a month later, he killed her violently. This cousin had been my favorite cousin. This friend had been a good friend once. I was doubly devastated by the tragedy of losing her and feeling like all the good memories I had of him were false. A facade he wore. I know I will never get closure on that aspect. It is strange to hear people say his name with such contempt and to react the same way myself. Story 12. I went with a friend to confront a man we somewhat knew for taking something from my friend's truck. We arrived at his house, and he opened the door immediately saying, "I'm glad you came early. I have your item." He told my brother he put it in his garage. This completely defused the situation, and he emphasized that we should stay for the Saturday night party as well. We stayed, had a good time, and left around midnight. After most people had left, around 3 in the morning, there was a fight over a drug deal. The homeowner pulled out a knife and killed the drug dealer. Under the influence of narcotics, he then acted irrationally, put the body in his trunk, and took it out toward the Mayaka swamps. He stopped at the first offshoot from the river, sliced the body several times, and threw it over the railing. The problem was that the next day, in daylight, the body was clearly visible because there was no water in the drainage canal. By lunchtime, he was under arrest. The man we went to confront later went to jail for murder. Story 13. It's upsetting. In all 3 cases, I knew them as boys, and in my heart, I still see them that way, just as little boys. In all 3 cases, there was clearly something wrong from very early on, but they still had all that potential and innocence, and there were sweet things about them. Story 14. I knew a man who later assaulted someone causing death. Honestly, I was shocked. On the few occasions he spent time with us, he seemed like a relaxed, easygoing person. Story 15. Heartbreaking. Surreal. Unfathomable. It is incredibly hard to reconcile that reality with the person you know. It challenges your faith in your own judgment to a great degree, and it is even worse when it is a small town and you have connections to almost everyone involved. Story 16. I knew someone who was later accused of being the worst child molester in the history of his city, which is a large city. He said he wanted to defend himself, But to spare the children, the state offered him a plea deal of 34 years, which he accepted. Looking back, everything feels much creepier, especially some of the things he said. It pains me to think of it all. His case was truly depraved. Story 17. I did not know the man, but my husband and I were trying to change a flat tire in a parking lot and were having a lot of trouble with it. My husband was about to give up when I looked up and saw a scruffy-looking man riding toward us on a bike. He got closer and asked if we needed help. We started talking, and it turned out he had been accused of murder and had to go to trial. I do not remember if he said he was guilty or not. We were just grateful for the help. Story 18. He was my high school bully. He targeted me and the other minority in our class. He called us awful names and was physically violent. After high school, he tried contacting me several times, pretending he wanted to apologize for the past. I always refused. He went to prison for a few years for assaulting someone with a shovel. After he was released, he tried contacting me again. I refused. Eventually, his attorney reached out to me and others to write character letters for his murder case. He murdered a veteran and her dog, a mile from my work. He fled the state but was caught. He is on prison dating websites. Story 19. I knew a man who lived in the area where I worked. He was known for driving around trying to pick up young teenagers. I saw him once trying to talk a 13-year-old into his car, promising her a job as a model. I walked over and confronted him, yelling that I would have his testicles for earrings. To my surprise, he backed down before the girl's father heard me yelling and came outside. Later, he was arrested for the kidnapping and rape of two 14-year-olds. He received a 10-year sentence for that, but after his release, he killed a young woman and was given a whole life sentence with a minimum of 21 years. Then police found the remains of two missing teenagers at one of his former homes. There is an unsolved rape and murder of a young teenager from just before the kidnapping of the two girls that was probably committed by him. In prison, he boasted of killing 48 people. I was foolish. I was smaller and lighter than most of his victims and could have easily become another statistic. Story 20. My cousin killed an elderly social worker. When I heard about it, I was not surprised. He was always an unstable person. Story 21. It was not surprising. He basically told people it might happen, that he might kill someone. He tried to get help. He tried to get himself admitted to a psychiatric ward. But in my country, that is difficult. In the end, he killed a mother in front of her child. Then he called the police on himself and got admitted, but only at the cost of a life. Story 22. He was a pathological liar who worked with one of my roommates. He and his wife were supposedly moving cross-country. We threw a big going-away party for him at my house on a Saturday night. He seemed perfectly normal, happy, smiling, perfectly normal, all the while lying to our faces. His whole adult life was one big lie built on top of lies. He had everyone fooled. His wife figured it out and he killed her the next day. Story 23. Worked with a man who was convicted of shooting the person who raped his niece. He was a nice person, worked hard, was always on time, and would help if asked. He never talked about it in detail but would explain what happened. Basically, he found out, grabbed his pistol, waited for the man to come out of work, and shot him in the face. Story 24. Local troublemaker, always in trouble. Lived a couple of blocks away. Ended up stabbing his uncle to death with a screwdriver. It was frightening at the time, but looking back, it is just sad. It was a bad situation that could have been prevented if mental health had been taken more seriously. Instead, people just talked about him and avoided him. Story 25. Oh, bizarre. I had known him at university as another mature-age student in class, a bit of a bogan, but he was clearly enthusiastic about books and learning. He also worked at the university pub, and a year after I had been in class, he shot a couple of people who also worked there. One of Australia's rare school shootings before gun control. Story 26. I felt vindicated. I told my wife not to bring this crazy woman around. She told me that I was being ridiculous. A few years later, now my wife thinks I am some kind of Federal Bureau of Investigation profiler. Story 27. He was a bully in high school. I was forced into physical education with him, and he picked on me constantly. I had bad acne and was overweight, so it was easy for him to gather a group to help him. He was arrested for burglary one weekend, and I never saw him again in person. Decades later, I found out he was executed for rape and murder. Story 28. The girl I took to senior prom was arrested for attempted murder of her husband about 10 years after high school. We grew apart, and I lost touch with her until I read the newspaper article. I knew her husband but did not know they were together until then. Honestly, he was one of those power-tripping individuals. The only real shocker is that she stopped at attempted murder. I have still not attempted contact. Story 29. People are like other people. I mean, they are no different from anyone else really. No red flags or anything. Actually, this one guy I grew up with killed 2 people, and he was always a really nice guy who would help others all the time. Most murders are crimes of passion or occur between people who know each other. Sometimes things spiral out of control, and someone you never thought capable just becomes a murderer. Story 30. My parents grew up with him and were once close. We are friends with his entire family, including his twin brother. He went to prison very young for various drug and burglary offenses. He ended up getting involved in white supremacy gangs for protection, allegedly. From what I know now, he is higher up in the prison rankings. I met him when I was about 9 and he had just been released. I had heard stories about him growing up. He was huge, probably 6'5" on steroids and covered in gang tattoos. It was strange. He knew of me from letters his brother sent him, and I could tell it was awkward for him to be back. I didn't understand the gang situation until I was older. He ended up killing someone over a marijuana deal a few years later and received a life sentence. I think my parents and his brother are still somewhat haunted by who he once was. A nice kid who got in trouble. He hasn't been that person for a very long time. I was told not long ago that he had pictures of me playing baseball in his cell, which is wild to think about. Story 31. I met a guy in college who lived in the dorms but was in his late 20s. We were decent friends, we would hang out sometimes, go to parties together, and I would give him rides to donate plasma or to grab some food. Nothing really out of the ordinary, other than him being 10 years older than everyone else in the dorms. One day he asked for a ride to buy some cigarettes, and I really did not want to because it was late and a blizzard had started. But he begged, so I relented. On the way back to the dorms, my car slid on ice and we got into an accident. The woman in the other vehicle said she was calling the police. My friend turned to me and said, "Yeah, I have to go," then bolted from my car and sprinted across a massive snow-covered field in the middle of the night. I was stuck for about 2 hours dealing with the situation and never saw my friend again after that. A week or 2 later, someone said, "Did you hear about him? He has been charged with murder." I never found out what happened, but it would explain why he ran when he found out the police were coming that night. Story 32. My sister's childhood friend appeared on the news 20 years later. He was not accused of murder, but it was a situation where manslaughter was a reasonable conclusion, although it would not have been prosecutable. 2 men left shore in a boat. Only one returned. Seeing him on the news for this was a that tracks moment. We moved about 40 kilometers to keep my sister away from him, which I believe she does not know to this day. Story 33. I have a very close friend from college who is currently serving a life sentence for a double homicide. I had seen him partying a lot before it happened and knew he got into some trouble here and there. Nothing too serious for our group. He was arrested very suddenly, and no one knew what was going on. I ended up being the one to find his information on the county jail website, and I, along with everyone else, was shocked to see the charges and the extremely high bail that was set. I was also the first person he called from jail after his mother and girlfriend. He told me he did not do it, that they had no proof he was profiled, and it was a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His mother asked me to take the lead on many things related to his case. I spent hours on the phone taking notes and paying for the time the inmate called me. I also contacted other people and spoke with justice organizations. It did not take long, but it took some time for me to realize he was guilty. I cut ties almost immediately after that. I did not want my name associated with a murderer, even in a letter of support to the court. I did not want to help him after I learned he had killed people. The incident was over drugs and possibly a woman. They had footage from a neighboring security camera. The case took a very long time. I believe he is appealing the length of his sentence now. Sometimes he still calls me, but I never answer. Story 34. My first boyfriend went on to kill his next girlfriend. He was absolutely a psychopath. He was only around 19 at the time of the murder and had been involved in petty crimes. He was very eccentric. He never did anything heinous to me, but in hindsight it was obvious. I was very young. I went on to date exclusively sociopaths and psychopaths, which this formative experience probably explains. There were other traits in the relationship, such as being obsessed, possessive, unempathetic, and unconcerned about rules, laws, and norms. I was not exactly shocked. I was sad because the victim was a friend of mine in high school, and she was only 18 or maybe 19. But I honestly was not surprised at all. I wrote to him in prison about 15 years later, and he sent me some strange letters, artwork, and requests. Story 35. I found out my grandfather, the greatest man I've ever known, killed my biological grandfather. I think I was around 12 when I found pictures my mother had put away in a box with newspaper clippings of a man I had never seen. I am not religious at all, but grew up in Baptist churches where my grandfather would preach. It was shocking to find out that this man had murdered someone. Apparently, my grandmother was having an affair with my biological grandfather and became pregnant. After my mother was born, my grandfather caught them together and shot him with a shotgun while my infant mother was in the back seat. My grandmother kept my mother's blood-stained dress until she passed away. I never let my grandfather know that I knew his secret and still can't believe the most loving, kindest man I've ever known was capable of something like that. Story 36. My cousin killed her husband after years of physical abuse. He came home drunk one night and fell asleep, and she stabbed him to death. I felt so sorry for her because she also had a horrible childhood, being sexually abused by her father. She went to court, and the jury acquitted her because she had evidence of all the hospital reports and photos of her injuries over the years. Story 37. I know at least two people. The girl who lived down the street became addicted to methamphetamine and participated in a home invasion and murder. I never would have expected it because she seemed somewhat bright, and I always expected that from her older, unpleasant brother. The other was a marijuana user I knew from middle school. He was pretty nice, and I thought he was too lazy to get into much trouble, but he was involved in murdering a girl who attended my high school and later involved in robbing and murdering the manager of a fast food restaurant. Story 38. Weird. He bartended at a couple of places I would go to every once in a while. We were Facebook friends. We are not anymore, but I had no idea he was capable of what he did. It is just surreal. He is on trial now and appears on the regional local news fairly often. Story 39. There was a group of 4 kids in my grade and the one below that were accused and found guilty of murder. The lone female, I never would have expected it. She was quiet and polite. The one guy I kind of knew, I am not terribly surprised. I think he was in or affiliated with gang activity, although it was more than 20 years ago and the details are fuzzy. They are both still in prison. The brother of a friend of mine was accused of murder. But when the trial happened, it came out that he was jumped by 5 or 6 gang members, grabbed a beer bottle from the street to defend himself, and struck in self-defense. He was acquitted. He now has a wife, a house full of children, and a job on an oil rig. Story 40. Not me personally, but my friend went to elementary school with someone who was later arrested for stalking and attempting to kidnap a random woman. He completely admitted to the police that he intended to murder this poor woman. He was given a pretty lenient sentence, which was disheartening. Story 41. Older brother of a friend of mine. A very kind family. My mother coincidentally worked with the mother. He was always a nice person in high school. As a young adult, he developed schizophrenia and during a psychotic episode, harmed his mother. I believe he is still in a mental institution. Story 42. I had a coworker who was a little eccentric but nothing too crazy. Then one day, I read the news and saw his mugshot. He was in jail accused of stabbing someone to death over a girlfriend. He was convicted and has been in jail for quite a few years. I think it was a drunken crime of passion, but beyond that, he never had the demeanor of a killer. It is a shame because overall he was a good person, at least until taking that person's life. Story 43. When I saw the news and it showed his name and face, I said, I knew it, and immediately called an old friend to tell her we were right about him. This man had been on the periphery of our college friend group, and every time he showed up to a party or gathering, he was just off. There was always something odd about him that you couldn't quite identify. 20 years later, his name came up as the main suspect in his wife's disappearance and assumed murder. There was a lot of blood evidence in his car. I called my friend and said, "So-and-so murdered someone." It was a surreal feeling to know I had spent time and had conversations with a future murderer. Story 44. Guy I used to party with in college stopped hanging out because of his behavior. When I heard the news, I immediately knew what likely happened, and it went the way I thought. He had a real bad drinking problem, liked camping, and was unsafe with guns. He ended up killing a college student while blackout drunk at a campsite. Story 45. Quiet, visibly unimpressive, somewhat of a loser, ended up murdering his wife. He had been a candidate for sheriff, which was unsurprising. Story 46. Without giving too much away, I have known two people who were later found guilty of killing another person. One was a man who worked security at the place where I was working. He would hang out with my team often, always smiling and cracking jokes. His wife was pregnant, as was I, and he would talk about how excited he was to be a dad. When I complained about pregnancy issues, he would empathize and talk about how his wife was going through the same thing. He was later found guilty of murdering his pregnant wife. The other was also a coworker from a different job. She had been in an abusive relationship, and eventually I saw his obituary in the papers. I went to the funeral and consoled her. It later came out that she had put an end to the abuse, and it was ruled self-defense. In both cases, I was shocked. It was incredibly surreal, especially the first one. Nothing about either of them indicated they were capable of taking a life. You never really know what someone is capable of. Story 47. Let's call him Larry. Larry was an older gentleman who worked with my dad as a truck driver. He was probably around 60 when I met him. Around the 2000s, their company followed industry trends and shifted from longer layover runs to overnight runs. Instead of driving to a destination, staying there until their hours of service reset, then driving home, they would drive to a destination and then back home. Larry had always done those layover runs, and since he only had to drive to work 2 or 3 times a week, he lived pretty far away from the terminal. But as those runs changed and he got older, he needed a place to stay. My sister had moved out, so we had a spare bedroom, and he rented it from my parents for cheap. That's how I knew Larry. Larry was close to retirement, or should have been. His wife, Barbara, had been moderately successful herself in their small town, but had retired and expected Larry to support her very expensive tastes. Constantly redecorating their house, buying a new car every year or two, shopping sprees for herself or her friends. Looking back, it was likely she had undiagnosed mental health issues that had suddenly worsened. Apparently, Barbara had always been a bit like this, but around this time it got bad. He had to dig into his retirement account to pay off their debt and basically went from being about to retire to being delayed by about 5 more years, at least. Larry filed for divorce. Barbara filed a restraining order, made claims of abuse, and got him removed from the house. She then proceeded to open several credit cards in Larry's name and put him several $100,000 in debt, continuing her shopping sprees. They went to court, and the judge did nothing about Barbara's financial fraud and abuse, awarded her the house, half of his pension, and basically gutted him financially. The next day, Larry went to the house under the pretense of dropping off a check for her half of the pension funds. Instead of a check, he brought a shotgun. He killed Barbara, then himself. Story 48. I wasn't very close to this man, but I knew him. One night, by the waterfront, he asked a man for a cigarette. The man gave him one. When he asked for another, the man said no. This man then stabbed him multiple times and went to jail, of course. He was an odd person. Story 49. A guy I know from high school. I dated his older brother. He murdered his girlfriend during his sophomore year of college. He denied it, of course. My family went to the trial every day to support his family. He was not convicted. What convinced me he did it was when he made a serious suicide attempt during the trial while watching his lawyers present their case. He moved away and so did I. The funny thing is, we both ended up in the same small town 20 years later. Story 50. I partied with this man at the Black Angus restaurant about a month before the first killing. I was barely 21. I danced with him and hung out until last call. He wanted to keep the party going. I am so lucky that night. I went to the Black Angus with some friends and told the man I had to go back home with them. There were some men in my friend group and I think that helped deter him. Story 51. I was the camp counselor for someone who was later convicted of execution-style murder. Definitely not the kid I remembered. Story 52. A relative of an in-law killed her husband for money. I got along okay with her, but my siblings suspected her from the start and said she was bad news. She ended up dying in prison. Story 53. I went to primary school with a kid who recently went to jail for murder, and I could honestly see it coming from the age of about 8. He was always unbelievably violent and frequently suspended from school for physically attacking students or teachers for no apparent reason. Fighting was not uncommon at my school. Everyone grew up in a bad area, so bad behavior was expected. However, this kid was exceptionally brutal from a very young age. After he left school, I learned that he broke into a man's house while the man was still at home. He restrained the man, boiled water in the kitchen, and poured it over him before leaving. Later, he murdered someone over a very small amount of money that was owed to him. I am usually against the death penalty, but I truly believe the world would be better without this person in it. Story 54. I worked somewhere, and one of our regular customers was a mouthy, brash man. I did not like him because he seemed nasty beneath his brashness. Anyway, he hired a hitman to kill his wife. I was not shocked. Story 55. We were around the same age in our early 20s working in a call center. He was one of my cubicle corner buddies. We had many conversations during breaks. He was attractive and very flirtatious, but I was turned off by the number of children he had with different women. He was about 20 years old with 5 or 6 children. Most of his children had passed away due to sudden infant death syndrome. One day, rumors spread that one of the mothers had mysteriously died after going to the authorities. A few days later, he was killed in a police standoff. It turned out some of the mothers were underage, and he had killed those babies. Story 56. My grandmother's nephew murdered his girlfriend, her young child who was not his, and her parents. They lived in the neighboring state. He was the child of one of her much younger siblings, and his parents had moved away before I was born. I believe I met him once. He ended up in prison in my state, and my grandmother visited him regularly while I was out of state. She was the only family he had nearby. He was released and killed those people in a murder-suicide. Good riddance to bad trash, was what my grandmother said about his death. I do not believe we have any more criminals in the family. Story 57. The manager I worked with used to have a serious drug problem. She cleaned herself up, left her boyfriend, and was doing well. She relapsed, went back to the boyfriend, and quit her job. I heard stories from co-workers about how poorly she was doing. Her dealer found religion and stopped selling but still wanted to explain himself to them. She lured him to a secluded place in the woods, where her boyfriend ambushed and murdered him. I had heard about the murder but was shocked when I learned it was them. Methamphetamine, indeed. Story 58. I taught a student in 5th grade. He was already headed down the wrong path, a victim of his circumstances. He had huge anger issues but was capable and smart. He was a poster child for childhood trauma, being used for drug running in his community by his family. In his early 20s, he walked into a bar and shot 2 people, killing one. I was not surprised to learn this, just sad. If he had grown up in a different community with a different family and access to mental health services, he could have gone down a very different path. I have periodically encountered other students who remind me of him and wonder what path they will take. Story 59. I knew a kid in high school who was outgoing, friendly, and on the varsity basketball team. He had dreams of playing in college and making it to the National Basketball Association. A year after high school, he was involved in a botched home invasion with a small group, during which he shot and killed someone. He is now facing 20 years in prison. Based on court hearings, he is not accepting responsibility and is trying to claim it was not him. Story 60. A friend of mine from work went back to a hotel room with a married woman after a night at the bar. There is proof that he was invited in and did not force his way. A while later, she was strangled to death. It honestly affected me for a while. We were pretty good friends despite a 10-year age gap. We used to hang out after work. He was at my wedding. A few months before this happened, we randomly exchanged Christmas gifts without planning it. If you told me he killed someone in a bar fight or a driving under the influence accident, I would not be shocked. This was a surprise, though. Story 61. He dated my friend for a couple of years when we were teenagers. Okay guy, but a little intense. He is now in prison for murdering a few women. Still processing it, to be honest. Cannot even imagine how my friend feels. Story 62. A few years ago, a couple of friends of mine were accused of what the police and prosecutors described to the media as a fairly vicious and unprovoked murder. I did not do what most of their other friends did. Disown them or wonder how I did not know they were like that. I used critical thinking, determined that the story did not add up with what I knew of these people, concluded that the story they told me made more sense than the police story, and remained friends with them. The charges were dismissed because the police lied and the media believed them. Story 63. There is a pattern in the stories. Most of the murderers were men. Most of the victims were women. It is understandable that women would choose a bear. Story 64. My school friend's brother was a quiet guy, studious but pleasant. One day, for some reason, he took a kitchen knife and stabbed an old woman a few times at a bus stop, then casually walked back home. His hand slipped and he badly slashed one hand. The police followed the blood trail to his house and found him waiting for them to arrest him. According to the police, he was calm and polite. He was sent to a secure hospital. After I left school, I lost track of my friends, so I have no idea how his brother is now. Story 65. My uncle was framed for murder. He was on a work trip 6 hours away, so it barely mattered. He is still acquaintances with that man. Story 66. One of the nicest guys I knew did not think he was capable of hurting a fly. He was on a lot of drugs when it happened, and the victim was someone pretty young, around 18 to 20 years old. The victim's parents advocated for less jail time and more focus on education, treatment, and community service. Last I knew, he was out and working in the community to educate people on the dangers of drug use. Story 67. My first boss left the company because he was going to be fired if he did not leave voluntarily. I found out a year later that he died by suicide. I later learned that he was arrested a week before for attempting to strangle someone, possibly his wife. I was shocked and did not believe it at first. He seemed like a nice person to me but was definitely struggling with personal issues. Story 68. This lovely family had their oldest child starting kindergarten at the same time as mine. The wife was pregnant with their third child. He was really laid back and easygoing. Later, we found out that his family members were pressuring authorities to charge him with the murder of his parents, which had happened 20 years earlier. The relatives succeeded, and there was a trial that started around the same time the baby was born. The baby was 6 weeks old when he was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. The school community rallied around the shell-shocked wife. He had always told her that his difficult relatives were his problem and she did not have to worry about it. She came home from court and thought, well, it's my problem now. She set up a team with their friends to read through all the evidence that convicted him, and it took them 3 years to launch an appeal with 17 challenges to the state's evidence. The judges listened to the first 5 challenges and agreed to acquit him. This was all over the news, and when my children came home from school, I burst into tears and said, "C's daddy is coming home." But he was not coming home until the next night. Meanwhile, this shell-shocked mother went home and could not bring herself to tell her own kids how it had gone and that their dad was being released. The next day, my kids went up to C and said, Your dad's coming home. C said, someone else told me that too. Then the media were at the school and outside their house, and I deeply regret that I did not offer to keep my kids home from school that day and have C over too, in a safe, neutral environment. But it never occurred to me, and God knows, I will never be in that situation again. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.